All right, today, amid just the blitz of headlines on what has been a gigantic news day following a gigantic news week, you might not have noticed the news today. You might not have seen the headline today that today a federal court blocked the Trump administration from cutting energy funding just for blue states. This is billions of dollars Congress appropriated for clean energy projects of various kinds all over the country. Trump administration decided, and they admitted this, they decided that just in blue states, just in states that didn't vote for Trump, they would cut all of that funding. They'd leave the funding in place in states that voted for Trump. They would cut it in states that didn't vote for Trump. A federal court today ruled that that is illegal and stopped the Trump administration from doing that. That ruling today came after another federal court today stopped Trump from shutting down a big offshore wind farm in Rhode Island and Connecticut. Trump's shutdown of that project, according to the courts today, was also illegal. And so yet another federal court blocked Trump on that as well, so that work on the wind farm will be able to go ahead. Both of those rulings today follow last night yet another federal court blocking Trump, this time from cutting funding to the American Academy of Pediatrics. This is a doctors group, a pediatricians group that criticized the flock of ducks level insane quackery at Trump's Department of Health and Human Services under RFK Jr. Trump responded by canceling federal grants for the American Academy of Pediatrics. A judge has now ruled that that was illegal retaliation, and so Trump is blocked from doing that. That funding has to be reinstated. That ruling comes after another federal judge just blocked Trump from cutting off federal election funds to states in retaliation for them not changing their election rules in ways that Trump wants. The judge said, quote, "The Constitution assigns no authority to the president over federal election administration." And so Trump got blocked on that one, too. Shall I keep going? I could keep going. Another federal court just blocked Trump from freezing billions of dollars for childcare and social services for kids, again, in Democratic-run states, as some kind of punishment against those states for electing Democrats, punishing them for that by cutting off the Temporary Assistance to Needy Families program.
Friends, thank you for being here today. In an era defined by the 24-hour news cycle, where headlines scream for our attention with increasing volume and decreasing substance, it becomes the duty of the thoughtful citizen to pause, to step back, and to separate the signal from the noise. We are currently witnessing a moment in American history that feels chaotic, perhaps even unprecedented. The headlines appearing on our screens suggest a presidency in freefall, Trump meltdown. Lawmakers demand resignation, constitutional crisis. But as those of us who have watched the ebb and flow of American politics for decades understand, the truth is rarely as simple as a chyron on a cable news screen. Before we go further, I'd love to know, when you see these flashing headlines about a meltdown, do you see a genuine constitutional crisis unfolding, or do you see just more political theater? Let me know your initial thoughts in the comments below. Today, I want to invite you into a deeper conversation. We are going to look past the sensationalism to examine the machinery of our government. We need to understand the collision course currently taking place between the executive branch and the legislative branch. The narrative being presented to the public is that lawmakers are formally demanding President Trump step down following his January 3rd military strike on Venezuela and a cascade of federal court defeats. But we must ask the difficult, necessary questions. Is this a genuine institutional movement toward the removal of a sitting president, or is it a rhetorical storm held back by the sturdy firewalls of political reality? To understand why this specific confrontation over Venezuela represents a unique threat to the Trump presidency, distinct from the scandals of the past, we must look at the data, the law, and the Constitution itself. To fully grasp the magnitude of this moment, we must first examine the context of what can only be described as a judicial siege surrounding the administration. To understand the current meltdown described in recent reports, we cannot look at the Venezuela situation in a vacuum. We must first understand the pressure cooker the administration currently finds itself in on the domestic front. In the last 48 hours alone, the Trump administration has suffered a string of defeats in federal court that are striking not just for their frequency, but for the legal principles cited by the judges. This is not merely about judges disagreeing with policy, it is about the judiciary enforcing the boundaries of administrative law. First, consider the ruling regarding energy funding. A federal court has blocked the administration from cutting clean energy funding specifically for blue states, those states that did not cast their electoral votes for Donald Trump. The administration had signaled an intention to leave funding in place for states that supported him while stripping it from those that did not. In the eyes of the law, this is not just bad politics, it is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause and the fundamental administrative requirement that government actions cannot be arbitrary and capricious. The court stepped in to say that federal funds, appropriated by Congress, cannot be used as a tool for partisan reward or punishment. Simultaneously, we saw a similar ruling regarding offshore wind projects in Rhode Island and Connecticut. The administration attempted to shut these projects down, but the courts intervened, citing a lack of legal standing for the executive to unilaterally cancel infrastructure projects that have already cleared regulatory hurdles. This speaks to the business community's need for regulatory certainty, a principle that traditional conservatives have championed for decades. Perhaps most concerning for constitutional scholars is the third ruling regarding the American Academy of Pediatrics. The administration attempted to cut funding to this doctor's group, allegedly in retaliation for their criticism of Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s policies at the Department of Health and Human Services. A federal judge ruled this to be illegal retaliation. This touches on the First Amendment rights of organizations to petition and criticize their government without fear of financial retribution. When you view these three rulings together, a pattern emerges. These are not isolated incidents. They establish a judicial narrative of illegal retaliation and executive overreach. The courts are effectively telling the White House that the power of the presidency is not absolute, and it cannot be weaponized to settle political scores. This judicial siege has left the administration bruised and defensive, setting the stage for the much larger, much more dangerous conflict regarding foreign policy. While domestic court battles are significant, the true catalyst for the current demands and the heart of the constitutional conflict is the Venezuela operation. We must be very precise about the grievances being raised here. This is not a matter of whether one supports or opposes the regime in Venezuela. The objection raised by Democrats, legal scholars, and indeed some Republicans is constitutional in nature. They argue that the fundamental doctrine of the separation of powers, the checks and balances designed by the Founding Fathers, has been breached in three specific, tangible ways. The first tangible breach concerns the War Powers Clause. Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution grants Congress, and Congress alone, the power to declare war. The War Powers Resolution of 1973, passed in the wake of the Vietnam War, was designed to ensure that a president could not unilaterally commit American blood and treasure to a foreign conflict without the consent of the people's representatives. Critics argue that the strike on Venezuela was not a defensive action against an imminent threat to the United States, but an offensive operation against a sovereign nation. By ordering this strike without seeking congressional authorization, the president effectively bypassed the legislative branch. For a generation that remembers Vietnam and the long debates over executive authority that followed, this is a profound concern. It raises the question, if a president can order a strike on a foreign capital without Congress, does the war-declaring power of the legislature still exist? I want to pause here and ask you a question that scholars are debating right now. Do you believe a president, any president, regardless of party, should have the unilateral authority to strike a foreign nation without Congress? Or do you believe Article 1 still holds weight? I'm very interested to hear your stance on this in the comments. Perhaps even more legally perilous is the second issue, the administration's claims regarding governance. The president has asserted that the United States would run or govern Venezuela for an indefinite period. We must scour the Constitution to find the source of such authority. We will not find it. The Constitution provides the president with the power of commander-in-chief, but it does not grant the executive the authority to act as a colonial administrator or to govern foreign nations by decree. Even in the aftermath of declared wars, such as World War II, the governance and reconstruction of foreign nations were complex processes involving treaties, congressional appropriations, and international law. A unilateral assertion of authority to govern a neighbor in the hemisphere has no basis in American constitutional law. It suggests a view of executive power that is unbounded by borders or statutes. Finally, we must address the third and arguably most potent tool in Congress's arsenal, the power of the purse. The president has signed orders directing how Venezuelan oil money would be managed, creating protected accounts he would control personally, and claiming authority over the distribution of these funds. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 of the Constitution states, "No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law." By seizing revenue and claiming personal discretion over its use, the executive branch is attempting to bypass the Appropriations Committee entirely. If a president can generate his own revenue streams through foreign operations and spend them without congressional oversight, the legislative branch loses its primary leverage over the executive. With these constitutional violations in mind, let's turn our attention to the demand itself, specifically the difference between rhetoric and reality. Given these weighty constitutional issues, it is no surprise that the rhetoric coming from Capitol Hill has reached a fever pitch. But we must be careful analysts of this language. We must distinguish between the political demand and the legislative reality. The Democratic position has hardened significantly. DNC Chair Ken Martin has moved beyond general criticism to issue an official statement accusing the president of violating international law. This is a grave charge. It moves the conversation from the realm of bad policy to illegal acts. Furthermore, the Progressive Caucus and other lawmakers are utilizing terminology that is historically reserved for the most severe crises. They are using terms like war criminal, illegal invasion, and coup. When a sitting member of Congress refers to the president as a war criminal, they are effectively stating that the president's conduct falls outside the legitimate exercise of his office. This is the language of impeachment. It is the language that precedes a constitutional rupture. However, rhetoric is not action. To understand the reality of the threat to the presidency, we must look at the legislative vehicles available. Currently, the primary vehicle is House Resolution 353, HRES 353. HRES 353 is a substantive document. It contains 7 articles of impeachment. These articles cover a range of alleged offenses, but 2 are particularly relevant to the Venezuela situation: international aggression and usurpation of congressional powers. Advocacy groups and legal experts argue that the Venezuela operation provides the concrete, factual evidence needed to activate Article 3 of this resolution. Previously, these charges might have been viewed as abstract or theoretical. Now, with a specific military strike and specific executive orders regarding oil revenue, the abstract charges have taken on physical form. Yet, despite the existence of this resolution, and despite the fiery speeches on the floor of the House, the resolution sits gathering dust. This brings us to the core of our analysis today. How do we distinguish between political pressure and actual removal proceedings? We must check the reality of the situation against the premise of the Meltdown headlines. Despite the intensity of the moment, a formal demand from Congress as a unified institutional body for Trump to step down has not occurred. To navigate this confusing landscape, it is helpful to categorize the actions we are seeing into 3 distinct buckets. Let's look at the first category, which consists of criticism and advocacy. This is the category where most of the noise is generated. It includes the speeches, the tweets, the press conferences, and the fundraising emails. The intensity here is high. Individual members are calling for resignation. Outside advocacy groups are mobilizing. This creates a perception of imminent change, but legally, it carries no weight. A president is not removed by a press release. This moves us to the second category, which represents institutional constraint. This category represents actual, tangible legislative success, though it falls short of removal. The prime example here is the Senate's recent action. The Senate advanced a bipartisan war powers resolution to restrict the president's authority to use military force in Venezuela without congressional approval. This is significant. It is a reassertion of Congress's Article 1 powers. It is the system of checks and balances working as intended. However, we must be clear about what this is. It is a prospective check. It limits what the president can do in the future. It is not a retrospective punishment for what he has already done. It says, you must ask us next time, not, you must leave office for what you did last time. This stands in stark contrast to the third category, formal removal proceedings. This is the category that matters for the survival of a presidency. This would involve the House Judiciary Committee marking up H-Res 353, voting on it, and sending it to the floor for a full House vote. Currently, there is zero movement in this category. The machinery of removal is stationary. The most interesting development, however, lies in that second category, institutional constraint. The Senate vote on the War Powers Resolution was bipartisan. 5 Republican senators broke ranks to join the Democrats. For observers of the Senate, this is a telling detail. Senators generally protect their own party's president. For 5 of them to cross the aisle suggests a genuine institutional discomfort with the scope of executive power being claimed. They are voting not necessarily against Trump the man, but for the Senate as an institution. They are signaling that even within the president's own party, there are limits to how much power they are willing to cede to the White House. Now, you might be asking, if the legal arguments are so strong, why hasn't he stepped down? This comes down to the political calculus. The answer lies in the cold, hard mathematics of political control. The House of Representatives is currently controlled by the Republican Party. The Speaker of the House is a Republican. The chair of the Judiciary Committee is a Republican. In the American system, the majority party controls the schedule. They control what bills are introduced, what investigations are launched, and what resolutions are brought to a vote. As long as Republicans hold the gavel, H-Res 353 will remain dormant in committee. It does not matter how compelling the constitutional arguments are. Without the political will of the majority party, the impeachment mechanism cannot be engaged. The barrier protecting the president is not a lack of evidence or a lack of legal theory. It is a firewall of partisan loyalty and political survival. President Trump, for his part, appears to understand this dynamic intimately. Reporting suggests that in private meetings with Republican lawmakers, he has framed the situation in stark terms. He has reportedly told them that losing the midterm elections would mean his impeachment. This is a revealing admission. By framing the midterms as a referendum on his survival, he is acknowledging that his safety is guaranteed only by a political majority, not by legal innocence. He is not arguing that he didn't do it. He is arguing that if his shield is removed, the consequences will be immediate. This turns the upcoming 2026 midterm elections into the true pivot point of this crisis. If Democrats retake the House in 2026, the criticism and advocacy we are seeing now will likely transform almost instantly into formal removal proceedings. The groundwork has already been laid. The resolution is written. The arguments have been rehearsed. The only missing piece is the majority vote to turn the key. To appreciate why this specific deadlock feels so heavy, we must place it against the backdrop of history, for we have walked this path before, though the terrain has shifted beneath our feet. Many of you will remember the autumn of 1973. It was a time of immense national anxiety, not unlike today. The nation was grappling with the revelations of Watergate, but simultaneously, there was a fierce legislative battle over the president's ability to wage war without congressional consent, a battle that culminated in the passage of the very War Powers Resolution we are discussing now. That legislation was born out of a bipartisan consensus that the imperial presidency, a term coined by historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr., had grown too powerful. The generation that fought in World War II and witnessed the quagmire of Vietnam decided that the executive branch could no longer possess a blank check. When we compare 1973 to the present moment, the contrast is illuminating. In 1973, the institutional pushback against President Nixon was not strictly partisan. It was, at its core, institutional. Senators from both parties viewed themselves as guardians of the legislative branch first and members of a political party second. The firewall protecting the president then was porous. It crumbled as the evidence mounted. When Senator Barry Goldwater and other Republican leaders went to the White House in August 1974, they went not to protect a Republican president, but to tell him that his support in the Senate had evaporated. They placed the Constitution above the party line. Today, that dynamic has fundamentally inverted. The institutional constraint we see, like the 5 Republican senators voting for the War Powers Resolution, is the exception, not the rule. The modern political ecosystem has evolved into a rigid binary structure where the survival of the president is inextricably linked to the survival of the party's power. For those of you who lived through 1973, I am particularly interested in your perspective. Does this moment feel different to you? Is the partisan divide deeper now than it was during Watergate? Share your memories and comparisons below. Your historical perspective is valuable to this community. Furthermore, we must consider the normalization of what legal scholars call the unitary executive theory. Over the last 40 years, legal minds within the executive branch, under both Republican and Democratic administrations, have aggressively advanced the idea that the president's authority over foreign policy and the executive branch is nearly absolute and cannot be micromanaged by Congress. What we are seeing with the Venezuela operation is the logical endpoint of this theory. When the administration argues that it can govern a foreign nation or redirect appropriations without Congress, they are testing the absolute limits of this legal philosophy. This is why the stakes of the current standoff are so incredibly high. It is not just about the specific policies in Venezuela or the funding of a wind farm in Rhode Island. It is about whether the precedents set in 1973, the idea that Congress is a co-equal branch with the final say on war and peace, still hold water in the 21st century. If the War Powers Resolution is ignored without consequence, and if the power of the purse is bypassed through executive fiat without a legislative check, then we are witnessing a quiet amendment to the Constitution, written not by a convention of states, but by the inaction of a divided Congress. The silence of the House Judiciary Committee is as legally significant as the noise of the protests outside. It signals that the imperial presidency that concerned our parents and grandparents has returned, perhaps stronger than before, protected by a partisan armor that the founding fathers may not have fully anticipated. So, friends, as we conclude, let's look at where this leaves us on the constitutional horizon. We are left with a picture that is far more nuanced than the Meltdown headlines suggest. The administration is indeed besieged by a judiciary that is strictly enforcing administrative law, blocking attempts to rule by fiat in domestic policy. Simultaneously, the president's actions in Venezuela have triggered a constitutional debate that cuts to the very heart of the American Republic. Who holds the power of war? Who holds the power of the purse? The anger we see on the news is real. The constitutional arguments regarding the separation of powers are substantive and deserve our serious attention. But we must recognize that the formal machinery of removal is currently locked behind a partisan wall. What we are witnessing is a stress test of the American system. We are seeing how far the executive branch can push its authority before the other branches push back. The courts have pushed back on domestic funding. The Senate has pushed back on future war powers. But the ultimate check, impeachment, and removal remains out of reach for the opposition. The continued pressure on the Venezuela issue is not just about foreign policy in South America. It is a preview of the central battleground for the 2026 elections. The question placed before the American voter will be one of checks and balances. Do we want a government where the executive is constrained by the legislature, or do we accept an executive with broad, unilateral powers? As we watch these events unfold, let us remain vigilant, let us remain informed, and let us continue to value the complex, sometimes frustrating, but always vital machinery of our constitutional republic. If you found this breakdown helpful in cutting through the noise, please hit that subscribe button to join our community. But more importantly, I want to hear your prediction. Based on everything we've discussed, do you think the 2026 midterms will actually shift this balance of power? I'll be reading your responses in the comments. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you in the next analysis.